Hi, everybody. As Dominic introduced, my name is Usman. Excuse me. I'm from the Computational Biology and Computational Geometry group. And as the name of my presentation, the title of my presentation suggests, I'll be talking about the role of the regulatory agencies in the case of the medical devices. So here's the outline for my presentation. I'll start with a brief introduction about software quality and how can we measure the software quality, the dilemma of how much software quality is needed, and that in the case of medical devices. I'll introduce a little bit, about the medical device industry and the current situation. Then I'll talk about the FDA process, the regulatory process, the problems with it, who gets approved, the legal issues, some latest updates on the FDA regulatory process, some figures, how good FDA is doing in the terms of approval times, solutions to FDA's problems, and then I will talk about issues of software dependability and how can we use this in the terms of to improve our regulatory process of today and some conclusions, insights. So what is software quality? Well, as I presented before, software quality is essentially, if we look in the everyday life, software quality, we call a software to be a quality software if it satisfies the customer needs, if it's traceable, if it satisfies the performance criteria. In terms of medical devices, that is essentially the safety. If it fits under budget, it fits on time, and if it serves the purpose. So essentially, we can define our software quality as a vector in 6 dimensions, or we can add as many as dimensions as we want, depending on the purpose of the software, or if we want to have some more features to it. So measuring software quality, first of all, software quality is a very vague notion. It's very hard to measure this thing. There is no model in there that can quantify the software quality. The reason being, the project nature and requirements are varying in everyday life, as we know. We are in everyday life, we are constantly under pressure in terms of time and budget, and the standards and models in the software engineering literature, they ignore the real life scenarios. The models that measure or help to measure somehow the software quality, actually there is no set measure as I said before, but they try to somehow approximate or give an idea of how much software quality there is related to a project. They are based on essentially 2 main principles. One is they can either count the errors or failures within the software and can have an idea about the software quality, or they can check the different features related to the software like adaptability, reliability, efficiency, usability, and a whole list that ISO and various other organizations have defined. Donaldson et al., they give a very useful representation of how we can measure the software quality. So essentially, as I mentioned before, we can take it as a vector in different dimensions, and we can, for each and every dimension, we can define a number between 0 to 1, as it can be seen in this figure, and in that way we can somehow have an idea or just an outline how much software quality there is, or quantification as to say how much software quality is related to a particular software project. So in the case of our medical devices, we can see that we can define the safety or the performance criteria to be between 0 and 1 to be 0.9, or we can even take it to like 100% level if we want, although that's not achievable. And the rest of the stuff, so basically this model helps us to make choices like where do we want to spend most of the resources in terms of achieving a good enough software quality. So once we have some sort of idea that, okay, how much is the software quality needed or how much is the software quality related to a software project, now the question arises, okay, how much do we want to exactly spend on, on achieving that amount of software quality? In the realm of software engineering, there are two main approaches to that. One is the Pragmatism, that's a good enough idea of good enough software quality, and the other is Idealism, that is like flawless or 100% software quality. So as the names define, pretty much explain themselves, I'll just briefly, try to get this idea across. So the pragmatists, they kind of think that first of all, it's not possible to measure software quality, which I mentioned before. It's true. So the way to go around this problem is they say that okay, we just start on solving the problems rather than trying to figure out how we can measure the software quality. So keep solving the problems, or whatever you find within the software product, and you keep on solving those problems until the perceived risk to shipment is less than or equal to perceived product quality. So it's essentially the idea of return on investment. Okay, how much we want to invest on trying to improve the quality of our software, so that we want to put it in the market, so we're successful and we make money out of it. That is the ideology in the everyday market, because people are out there to make profits. In the case of idealists, they say that it is possible to achieve 100% error-free software, and we need to keep trying. We need to keep trying the good practices that are mentioned by ISO, IEEE, and SEI models and standards. And somehow we'll be able to achieve 100% error-free software. They say human-based testing can be replaced by automation, which has some problems associated to it, as we know that automation and testing itself is a software, and that also needs testing again. So some comparisons, some drawbacks, and some advantages. First of all, pragmatists, using the pragmatist view, we can save a lot of valuable resources, whereas in the case of idealists, if we are using some ISO models and something, we have to go line by line on the paper, whatever guidance or guidelines they have given us, and essentially we'll be labeling the coffee pots and stuff like that. So it's trying, we are wasting a lot of valuable resources. One advantage of that is that we can formalize the definition, or we try to formalize the definition of software quality, whereas pragmatists don't give us any kind of discrete measure for software quality. We can, by using this approach, the project can be oversimplified, and whereas in this case, the idealists, that it's simply not achievable in the finite amount of resources. So in the case of medical devices, there is a certain level of dependability required. The reason being there is a direct or indirect impact on human health and life due to the software that's used in the medical devices. So that's how the medical software is different from the software that we're using in everyday life. But since there is an inherent uncertainty in the software systems, that makes the idea of dependability to be probabilistic. So there cannot be an absolute measure, so to say, for dependability. There are some regulatory agencies that are doing the job, as mentioned in the previous presentations by Zareen and Nagme. FDA, CDRH, that's the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, that's comes under FDA, and that's based on a medical device modernization. No, actually, that's a Food, Drug and Cosmetic Amendment, and MDA Amendment of 1976. Then in the case of Canada, we have CMD-CAS, that's Canadian Medical Device Conformity Assessment System. Some other certification standards, FDA has just recently, they want the medical device companies to comply with ISO 13485 and ISO 13488 standards in order to qualify for their approvals. And then there are CMM, that's Capability Maturity Model Software Quality Levels, that's based on what good practices you're using in your manufacturing process. Just a brief outlook on the medical device industry. As we can see that it has grown tremendously, in the last years, and as of now, it employs 280,000 workers in the U.S., and the output is valued to be $43 billion in the U.S. That's a huge number. FDA regulations, I'll just spend a very little time on explaining like what devices come under FDA regulations. And so basically, first of all, a medical device or software used in the medical device, or it can be a standalone software that has a direct impact on a health or life of a patient or a user that is subject to FDA approval. The second category can be a software library or over-the-shelf software, which is used essentially to create the software for a medical device. It is not subject to FDA approval. And the third category is if we have a standalone software or a software medical device that is subject to a competent human intervention, let's say a certified individual who is operating that machine or something. We don't need an FDA approval for that. Classes, as Zareen mentioned in her presentation, these are the three classes of the medical devices, which are, with respect to increasing associated risk. So how does the regulatory process work? FDA essentially, they have three main roles in the medical device, from production to in the market and everything. So first of all, we can see that we have research and development. Medical device comes into being. The producer has to go for the pre-market approvals or notifications. That includes, first of all, they have to classify their device. And based on their device classification, they can file an application for pre-market approval. Once they're approved, they come into the large-scale production, and FDA regulates the large-scale production by assuring the good manufacturing practices. And they make sure that everything, the process they're using to produce a medical device contains their guidelines and all that. Then once it comes into the market, there is a post-market surveillance where FDA does surveys, and as well as besides that, besides FDA surveys, the manufacturer itself is responsible for surveying the device if there is any adverse effect or any wrong thing noticed in the environment. If somebody is using it and somebody has injured, they have to report it. So there are some problems with the FDA regulation system, which I found on a lot of literature on that. First of all, the main problem is that this process, the regulatory process, is highly time-consuming. As we can see, in 1997, there were 7,000 deaths per year being reported only because of the unavailability of the cardiovascular pump. That was already available everywhere else, like in the UK and the Europe. Similarly, 900 deaths per year because of the omnicarbon heart valve, which was not available in the US because of its awaiting FDA approval. Now since it's so time-consuming, the problem is that it becomes difficult for FDA approval to reflect the latest technology, because by the time the FDA gives an approval, there has been a better technology in the same regard, which can be used. And in 2001, the average total review time was found to be 411 days, which should be at the max 180 days by law. So you can see it's a large number there. Secondly, it's a costly process. We transfer some of the costs. The thing is, being a costly process, FDA transfers some of the costs to the users and patients, and that's why we can see that some of the medical devices, when they come to the market, initially they are highly priced. And secondly, it also decreases the resources for research and development. And FDA is a monumental, costly enterprise. I mean, it costs $1 billion annually since 1994. And as an example, a medical device company, Medtronic, and it's a major medical device manufacturer, they moved their 12 new businesses and product lines to Europe. So a lot of companies are, picking up their stuff and moving to different countries because it's easier to get approved there. And essentially, they can sell those devices again with the help of internet and other web sources, and there is no problem there. Then another problem is that each approval is only applicable to a single clinical application. So if I have a device and later on the road I find out that, well, this device can also be used for a different purpose, well, I have to go through the whole process of approval, to get the approval to get my device to be used for a different application. There is no guidance about how the violations ought to be remedied. So if some company has done some violation, there is no way that FDA's guidance proves to be helpful. There is no distinct separation between software system and that's an integral part of medical device and software used for record keeping purposes. There are no guarantees. We can see Theric 25 and Job-Shelley failure, although they were approved by FDA. And the use of FDA devices, and because a lot of physicians, they are still using the FDA devices that are not approved. That's a lot of medical devices that are not approved by FDA, and the reason being there could be some legal consequences to that. The main problem causality is that FDA is first of all highly risk averse. There are personal incentives. So if I have I delay in the approval of a device, if there is a high risk associated to it, well, that's an incentive that I don't want to take any risk. That there is a pressure from Congress, bureaucracy involved, and then complexity of medical devices. FDA's regulations and compliances are extremely daunting. It's a daunting task to go through all the guidance documents, and only a few manufacturers comply to that. Then two main things, like FDA, they can either permit something bad to happen or prevent something beneficial from happening. Now the problem is they are trying to stop something bad to happen rather, and they are they're spending a lot of time in that regard, which creates a problem that a lot of beneficial stuff is stopped and in the pipeline. Very useful research was done by Fiona Scott, and what was done was that an analysis of approval times with respect to applicant and medical device characteristics, and they found that applications for large markets get approved faster. The reason being there is the quality and consumer surplus, both needed for increased speed. And early applications take much longer, so FDA tends to delay when consumers, producers, and complaints, the consumer surplus, are small. Then applications of large experienced firms get approved faster, so do the ones of the firms just ahead of it. The reason being that higher application quality in the case of large firms, whereas political pressure in the case of the applications just before them. And finally, complaints and pressures from firms is more influential to approval process compared to bribes. There are some legal issues involved to it, which I think Nagme also mentioned in her presentation, but this is a little bit different. There is an idea of informed consent that is essentially dealing with, let's say, if a physician is using a medical device that's not approved by an FDA and there is an injury resulting due to that. So in that case, many states have they have set up a reasonable practitioner standard or reasonable patient standard, and they are using that. But there are, like in a lot of the court cases that I went through and scanned through, the decision made by the court was different in different cases, and that depended upon the device approval status, the support in medical literature for non-approved use, and clinical indication in question. Also, FDA's actions are also subject to a judicial review, but it's first of all, the aggrieved parties don't go to court because they think that, well, if they go to court for this device, well, they have to come across FDA again, and there can be some sort of retaliation from FDA later on. Current FDA process, first of all, FDA has introduced the acceptable failure rate, which is clear from this diagram here. I also covered it in my last presentation. Secondly, clinical software becoming more powerful. FDA is seeming to prepare a tougher, more active stance against it. There are two main things in this regard. First of all is they have started creating a reference list of companies that inspectors report that have uncorrected or unresolved violations of GMP. So no approval applications are proceeded in these cases, and then they also are doing complete shutdowns of several facilities, which is kind of ridiculous. And then they have also introduced the clinical trials for devices companies similar to drug companies. 1997 Modernization Act, I mentioned that in my last presentation. I won't go that again. So one of the main things I want to mention here is that with all these new policies of FDA, we can see a more active stance by FDA against the medical device producers. Here is a chart for the pre-market approval times. As we can see, from 97 to 2001, the number of days required for the pre-market approvals has slightly gone up, so it's not improving that much. Right now, it should be at 180 days, and for the fiscal year 2001, we can see that although from 97 to 2001, the FDA number of days for application approval have gone down, but at the same time, the number of days that are non-FDA days, that's the days needed for.
You just go to your last slide and your research conclusions.
Okay. So this is essentially the idea of software dependability that I wanted to cover in the case of as a CS application. So there are some open research areas. First of all, we need to find out a statistical and probabilistic method for measuring the software dependability. This can be done using design diversity. In terms of design diversity, judgment and decision-making framework, and system and design issues. Secondly, we need regulation of medical devices on the internet. We need to find out a way of quantification of quality, and the main question again, the predicament of how much software quality in the terms of medical devices. Some reflections, and then I will conclude it. First of all, it is time and cost of medical devices development continues to rise with the diverse effects on people. There needs to be a significant overhaul of the regulatory industry. We can discontinue the bureaucracy and monopoly, and we need to redefine the goals for inspections and regulations, keeping in mind that the difference between reliability and safety, because some devices need to be reliable, whereas compared to other ones that need to be safe. So we have to somehow make a regulatory process such that basically focuses on those issues. And lastly, being content with a good enough software that can serve the purpose seems to encompass this idea, and in the modest amount of resources. These are my references, and any questions in this regard? Yeah.
You said that it's easier for manufacturers to obtain regulatory approval in other countries. Now, are you aware of any work which tries to be in favor of FDA by saying that the number of product defects or in fact harm to human injuries caused by devices which are FDA approved are a lot less than devices which are not FDA approved, which though have been approved elsewhere?
Okay, the question is that since FDA is taking a long time to approve the devices compared to the other regulatory agencies in different countries, is there an evidence that FDA is doing its job, essentially, correctly? Well, in the literature that I scanned through, pretty much, I kind of found that the FDA's process is based on bureaucracy and a lot of political pressure from the Congress. In the different countries, first of all, there is no monopoly in terms of regulatory process. There are a lot of companies competing in that regard, and in that sense, I would say the regulatory process is more efficient. It is doing better job compared to FDA. But in terms of numbers or the facts, I didn't see any that can really tell that FDA is doing a better job compared to the other countries. Although there are some figures that show that yes, FDA is taking a longer time, as I mentioned before in the case of a couple of my examples. Other questions?
Could you go back to your research? Where do you feel the emphasis should be to assist the FDA in making its decisions more quickly? Is it the pre-market part of it? Is it the testing part of it? I mean, where is the opportunity for reduction to that 180-day level?
Okay, the question is, how can we, based on these some points that I mentioned in my research areas, how can we help the FDA to bring down the timeline? Well, to the answer to your question, first of all, the thing is that FDA, they are spending a lot of time not only to check or test the safety of the medical device, they are also spending time on testing the efficacy or the efficiency and the functionality process. So, well, if we can, leave the efficacy to the user or the physician to decide, okay, well, this device is efficient, or even the competitive market forces, that can help. So FDA should be responsible only to check if this thing is safe or not. Secondly, FDA they can use a risk assessment model, as I mentioned here. The probabilistic methods, essentially. They need to come up with a way to find out, okay, how much probability is there that this device is that probable to be that much dependable in a sense, or less failure rate in that regard. So rather than treating all the devices in the same way, essentially the breakdown where they have the devices broken down into class 1, class 2, and class 3. This definition, the one that I give, is like highly risk averse or less risk averse or and even lesser risk averse. So in that case, if they have some sort of a quantification that, okay, there is this much probability with this device that there is, there could be this much risk involved to it, as I can show here, this chart. So, if they can do some sort of like a quantification that can be done in as a function of severity index versus the likelihood index, that can be helpful, rather than spending too much time, on something that's not even needed.
So the reason the FDA exists, as I understand it, is in fact to determine efficacy. You may remember we used to market snake oil, and it was supposed to keep Carter's little liver pills, which had no effect on your liver, whatever. There were devices, medications, reagents that simply didn't do anything, that didn't work. The public was fooled by that. The doctors were fooled by that. The doctors won't do the testing of it. We already have that example, even with reasonably effective medications. Isn't that abandoning one of the key reasons for having the FDA? Is the testing of efficacy?
Well, the question is that is the testing of efficacy, if we want the efficacy to be determined as a function of market forces or to be tested by the physicians or the users, are we abandoning the purpose of FDA? Well, to my knowledge and from the FDA policies and the FDA goals and the ideas, well, FDA is there first of all, and it is a government agency because they want to regulate that no harm happens to somebody while using a medical device or something that falls under the definition of a medical device. Now, if it's efficient or if what kind of functionality it gives us, this can be a competition. We can let the market competition decide this factor. If like how many different gadgets we have in a system, how better it serves the users. But at the same time, if we have FDA spending too much time on it, and at the other hand, there can be an improved device in the same time, so that thing can be avoided.
Okay, another thing I'd suggest then is in your final presentation, you need to support that viewpoint from the literature, because it seems to me that letting efficacy run free leads to snake oil. Mm-hmm. And you may have a very safe device, but if we spend hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in the health market applying it to people, assuming that someone will detect that it is or isn't working, that seems to me to be a problem. But I'd like to see your support, so it's not just your opinion, but that this is a well-based opinion. Anyway, thank you for the presentation.